I'm going to place my cards on the table at the outset, and that is that Bruce Catton, more than any other historian or writer, is the reason I've made my professional career teaching and writing and speaking about the American Civil War. As an 11-year-old, I purchased a copy of the American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War, which was published in 1960, just before the beginning of the centennial commemoration. Catton wrote the text for that book, and his graceful narrative, together with an array of memorable images, absolutely captivated me. I read and reread the book, poring over the bird's eye view maps of battlefields by David Greenspan, and virtually committing to memory large sections of Catton's text. By the time I read the American Heritage Picture History, Catton already had introduced readers of the post-World War II era to a renowned American army from an earlier epoch. Writing in the 1950s, he published 3 books about the Army of the Potomac that pulled readers into a transformative 19th century conflict featuring famous generals, storied campaigns, and most movingly, citizen soldiers whose stalwart efforts saved the Republic at its moment of greatest peril. Mr. Lincoln's Army came out in 1951, Glory Road in 1952, and A Stillness at Appomattox in 1953. The third won the Pulitzer Prize for History and a National Book Award. And the trilogy, which is going to be the focus of my talk this morning, propelled Catton to the front rank of historians who wrote about the Civil War for a popular audience. Building on the success of what came to be known as the Army of the Potomac trilogy, Catton deployed his surpassing narrative gifts and sharp analytical skills to produce a number of additional books between the mid-1950s and the mid-1970s. Near the end of his life, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the citation for which accurately described him as, quote, a man of letters and the preeminent historian of the Civil War. The Army of the Potomac trilogy, as Michael suggested, despite its age, remains a remarkable vehicle to introduce new generations of readers to a superb writer whose work illuminates the past in memorable fashion. The roots of Catton's trilogy can be found in a boyhood that brought him into contact with veterans who had fought for the Union. Born in 1899, he spent his formative years in Benzonia, Michigan, a village of fewer than 600 residents a few miles inland from the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. The Civil War veterans were men set apart, recalled Catton in his 1972 memoir, pillars of the community, the keepers of its patriotic traditions, the living embodiment, so to speak, of what it most deeply believed about the nation's greatness and high destiny. The small boys of the village, continued Catton, looked at the old soldiers in awe. Quote, those terrible names out of the history books, Gettysburg, Shiloh, Stones River, Cold Harbor, came alive through these men. They had been there. Catton entered Oberlin College while World War I raged in Europe. He left the school to join the Navy in 1917, served as a gunner's mate without seeing combat, and after a second short stint at Oberlin, he never got a degree, pursued a career as a journalist. He worked as a reporter with the Cleveland News, the Boston American, and the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And then in 1925, joined the Scripps Howard Newspaper Enterprise Association, which was a syndication service in Cleveland. In 1939, he transferred to that organization's office in Washington, D.C., where he began to write a syndicated column. While with the Plain Dealer in 1923, he published what probably were his first pieces on the Civil War, a series of short, unsigned articles about local Union veterans that he titled The Fading Blue Line. During World War II, Catton held a series of positions with the federal government. As Director of Information for the War Production Board, he observed complicated bureaucratic infighting and the web of civilian and military factors that went into marshaling and allocating war-related resources. He drew on his wartime activities to publish in October 1948, The Warlords of Washington, which, commented one reviewer, illuminated, quote, interdepartmental feuds, personality clashes, confusions of authority, and other aspects of the prodigious wartime military production. Although the warlords of Washington achieved very little commercial success, Catton, who was almost 50 years old, decided to leave the government and become a full-time writer of history. He first contemplated a novel featuring Major General George B. McClellan, but soon abandoned that project to focus on a nonfiction study of the Army of the Potomac. We should all be glad that he made that decision. He had been immersing himself in materials relating to the Civil War, including regimental histories written by and for members of Union units. You're all familiar with these. These regimentals, which often included excerpts from wartime letters and diaries, had appeared in large numbers between the late 1860s and the early 20th century. And in their pages, Catton found echoes of the stories he had heard the veterans in Benzonia, Michigan, tell the boys during his early years. In deciding to write about the Army of the Potomac, Catton also likely had in mind the recent work of Douglas Southall Freeman, a Pulitzer Prize winner whose Lee's Lieutenants, a study in command, had in 3 large volumes published between 1942 and 1944 chronicled the Army of Northern Virginia. In an obituary published in 1953, Catton described Freeman as a historian, quote, who did his job superlatively well. Preeminently a treatment of the rebel high command, Freeman's trilogy, noted Catton, also rendered the common soldiers who fought against the Army of the Potomac, as Catton put it, alive and believable and wholly fascinating. In time, the two men, Catton and Freeman, would be linked as successful authors of major works on the Civil War that reached a large audience. And I was part of that audience as a young boy in Colorado, really getting engaged with the Civil War. Catton's Army of the Potomac trilogy and Freeman's Lee's Lieutenants were books that I read and reread. Once committed to his project on the Army of the Potomac, Catton worked very efficiently, no doubt helped by his long habit of meeting journalistic deadlines. Academics can almost never meet a deadline. Deadlines for them are just a notion that you sometimes think about but don't really pay attention to. Catton met deadlines. Approximately 4 years of research and writing yielded the trilogy's 1,050 pages of text and nearly 70 pages of notes. Catton's sources included those Union regimental histories. He was the first historian to really mine them systematically. A limited number of unpublished materials, that is manuscripts, very few. Published sets of letters, memoirs, and other participants' accounts that were available at the time he was working, and the secondary literature on the Civil War as it existed in the mid-20th century. And it was minuscule compared to the literature that exists now. Catton relied most heavily, as he acknowledged in A Stillness to Appomattox, on the invaluable The War of the Rebellion, a compilation of the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. You all are very familiar with these. 127 volumes published between 1880 and 1901 by the U.S. War Department that print a vast number of documents, correspondence, reports, and other documents. They are still an absolutely fundamental primary source on the war. Writing for a general audience, Catton did not employ the type of rigorous citation characteristic of modern academic monographs. No attempt has been made to cite the authority for every statement made, he alerted readers in Mr. Lincoln's Army. Yet I think a few words about his notes are in order. They're located at the back of the books rather than at the bottom of the pages throughout the text. They're thus easy to ignore. If you don't want to look at them, you just keep reading. But those notes contain a good deal of engaging material that enhances the narrative. I even wonder why he put some of this material in the notes. It's so good. One of the notes for a chapter in Mr. Lincoln's Army contains a pair of useful and memorably worded observations about the battles outside Richmond in the late spring and early summer of 1862. An odd and frequently overlooked fact about the fighting on the peninsula, observed Catton, is that in no single battle was anything like the whole strength of the Army of the Potomac put into action. The climactic struggle of Gaines's Mill was, for most of the soldiers, simply offstage noises. In this regard, and with what I can imagine as a twinkle in his authorial eye, Catton added, quote, "McClellan himself was not much better off than the men in the ranks. A study of his letters and telegrams unmistakably depicts a man who never quite knew what was going on." Catton's attempt to place the first volume of the trilogy with a publisher proved frustrating. Books on the Civil War didn't sell well in 1950, and 3 prominent publishing houses turned him down before Doubleday, which was a major house, signed him up, offering a contract. Sales for Mr. Lincoln's Army and Glory Road scarcely exceeded 2,000 copies each, and the publisher actually thought about not even publishing the final volume. Catton proved successful in pressing his case for finishing the trilogy, but when A Stillness at Appomattox came out, it proved only marginally more successful. These sluggish sales could not be attributed to negative reviews. Henry Steele Commager, who was a leading historian and public intellectual of that era, called Mr. Lincoln's Army, quote, "one of the most exciting war narratives in our literature," and Glory Road, quote, "a splendid achievement, historical and literary." The New York Times' main book reviewer, a man named Orville Prescott, pronounced A Stillness at Appomattox, quote, "the best written and most interesting historical work about the Civil War I have ever read." The kind of blurb that you would like to get if you're a historian. And Bell Wiley, the historian whose The Life of Johnny Reb, published in 1943, had pioneered the study of the common soldier, termed Catton's 3rd volume, quote, "a magnificent piece of writing that includes passages with the grandeur and beauty of poetry." The Notice in Time magazine similarly lauded the narrative grace evident in all 3 volumes. Catton has spent 3 years making the Civil War sound as fresh and exciting as if it had been fought yesterday, wrote the reviewer in Time. Well, unexpected news in May 1954 changed the commercial picture dramatically. Invited to appear on NBC's Today Show, Catton learned that he had won the Pulitzer Prize for History. His publisher and agent hadn't told him. He actually learned while he was on camera on the Today Show. The prize not only opened doors that otherwise would have been closed, Catton later wrote, "it somehow gave me the courage to keep on going and more or less confirmed my notion that the kind of work I was doing was worthwhile." All 3 titles in the trilogy began to sell more briskly and eventually reached hundreds of thousands of readers in regular editions and in book club editions. These sales accelerated as the Civil War centennial approached in the early 1960s. My own set of the trilogy, which I still have, that's one of the books I saved, Michael, out of my original big library, came via a Book of the Month Club dividend that my mother had earned buying whatever it was she was interested in. Stephen W. Sears, a widely read and respected historian of the Civil War who worked under Catton in his early career, perceptively commented about the trilogy's long-term influence. "It was Catton's work," suggested Sears, not quite 50 years after publication of Mr. Lincoln's Army, "that stimulated interest among general readers in every aspect of the war during the Civil War centennial period. The trilogy," thought Sears, quote, "triggered a Civil War boom that lasted for several decades. Commemorative anniversaries, Ken Burns's PBS documentary, and other literary, cinematic, and cultural factors boosted interest in the conflict at various times, but the foundational importance of Bruce Catton's Army of the Potomac trilogy should not be overlooked in spurring interest among a lay audience in the Civil War." My own experience with groups of Civil War enthusiasts across the United States over many decades bears out Sears' assertion. Countless members of audiences have told me that reading one of Catton's books proved decisive in creating their interest in the war, as of course was my own experience. Several attributes explain both the trilogy's success and why it deserves continuing attention. Most obviously, the quality of the writing sets Catton's books apart. After almost 3/4 of a century, I believe he remains unexcelled as a stylist among historians who've written about the war. A lecture delivered to the Society of American Historians titled History as Literature afforded Catton an opportunity to identify what he thought made possible his own success. Quote, clarity of expression is what you must have to start with. Put on top of that any flourishes you like. You must begin with the ability to say what you mean in a way that other people can understand. Now, clarity of expression, which is at the basis of all literary achievement, depends on clarity of thinking. If you think clearly, you may be able to write clearly. Otherwise, not. The Army of the Potomac trilogy does include a few unsuccessful rhetorical flourishes, to borrow Catton's word, but overall it carries readers along with prose both admirably precise and often beautifully evocative. Catton excelled at brief biographical portraits that distill the essence of characters into a few memorable sentences. With George B. McClellan, for example, he offered a superb reading of the general's letters to his wife, Ellen Marcy McClellan. He was young for a conquering hero, observed Catton of the 35-year-old commander who built the Army of the Potomac. And it was only natural that he himself should have been impressed with his own eminence. But in going through the correspondence, one presently begins to find something more than the natural blinking of a man who is dazzled by his own good fortune, continued Catton. There's too much lingering on the adoration other men feel for him, on the wild enthusiasm he arouses, and on the limitless power and responsibility that are his. Catton closed with a question that raises the specter of McClellan's profound failures at moments of decision. Quote, what buried sense of personal inadequacy was gnawing at this man that he had to see himself so constantly through the eyes of men and women who looked upon him as a hero out of legend and myth? Anybody, any of you who've read McClellan's letters to his wife will see just how spot on Catton is here. It's hard to read those letters without just getting angry at McClellan. He's absolutely insufferable. A 6-page portrait of U.S. Grant in a stillness at Appomattox bristles with insights about the Union's preeminent commander. Ulysses S. Grant was a natural, wrote Catton of the new general-in-chief who would accompany the Army of the Potomac in the spring 1864 campaigns, an unmistakable Middle Westerner, bearing somehow the air of the little farm and the empty, dusty road and the small-town harness shop, plunked down here in an army predominantly officered by polished Easterners. The level of expectations for Grant, reminded Catton, was staggering. He was under great pressure. Hopes and fears centered on him, not to mention jealousies. The country at large believed he was the man who at last was going to win the war, and possibly very quickly. He was, continued Catton, a man infinitely more complex than most people could realize. Grant had experienced failure, and he sometimes harbored doubts. But Catton highlighted the general's key attribute, and it's an attribute that Grant's great friend William Tecumseh Sherman also emphasized. Quote, there was a flame in him, and there were times when he could not keep the winds from the outer dark from blowing in on him and making it flicker, but it never did go out. In other words, setbacks did not crush Grant the way they had crushed Sherman in the summer of 1861. Grant could handle the pressure, and he alone among the high command of the United States could do that, and Catton gets at that key attribute here. An ability to set the stage for dramatic action suffuses all three books. Catton allocated a good deal of attention to the Iron Brigade, perhaps the most famous unit in the Army of the Potomac, which comprised 5 Midwestern regiments, including one from Catton's own Michigan, the 24th Michigan. He ushered its soldiers onto the stage at Gettysburg in a paragraph that captured the men's sense of themselves, the escalating action on the morning of July 1st, 1863, and what the day's fighting would mean for the men in the unit. Quote, the Westerners fell into step and came swinging up the road. They're on the Emmitsburg Pike. Their black black hats tilted down over their eyes, rifle barrels sparkling in the morning sun. There were 1,800 fighting men in this brigade, and the men were cocky. Officially, they were the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division of the 1st Corps, and they figured that if the Army were ever drawn up in one long inspection line, they would stand on the extreme right of it, which somehow was cause for pride. As they ascended Seminary Ridge, the men could hear a battle developing on McPherson's Ridge to their front. And here I'll return to Catton's prose. On the ridge to the west, there was a crackle of small arms fire and a steady crashing of cannon, with a long soiled cloud of smoke drifting up in the still morning air. And at the head of the column, the drums and the fifes were loud, playing The Girl I Left Behind Me, probably, that perennial theme song of the Army of the Potomac, playing the Iron Brigade into its last great fight. Within a few hours, readers subsequently learned, roughly 2/3 of the men became casualties, 1,200 of them, a toll that ended the Iron Brigade's ability to function as a significant presence on future battlefields. The trilogy also displays an impressive breadth of coverage. At first glance, a military study of one army, the volumes in fact integrate political, social, and martial history in a way that conveys a remarkably full portrait of the loyal citizenry of the United States at war. Catton spoke to this point in a series of lectures at Wesleyan University that were published in 1958 as a slim volume titled America Goes to War. The Civil War has become preeminently a military narrative, he wrote, describing precisely what happened and why it happened on the field of battle. But Catton insisted that a conflict defined that narrowly, quote, would not be worth much continued study. With some of his World War II experiences likely in mind, he argued that the Civil War, quote, is clearly worth a great deal of re-examination because it shows how the American people made their democracy work at a time of most extraordinary trial and complexity. In dealing with the military campaigns, the selection of generals, the choice of strategic objectives, and all the rest, observed Catton, the Northern leaders never once forgot that what they really had on their hands was a political problem. Catton's sensitivity throughout the trilogy to the reciprocal relationships between military affairs and politics created a leitmotif. Its presence evident when he dealt in Mr. Lincoln's Army with the meaning of the Battle of Antietam. Fought to a tactical draw on September 17, 1862 at a cost of 23,000 casualties, the climactic engagement of Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the United States afforded Abraham Lincoln an opportunity 5 days later to issue his preliminary proclamation of emancipation. Now the war, wrote Catton, would be fought to the bitter end. The deep, tangled issues underneath the war, slavery, the permanence of the Union, the dawning concept that a powerful central government might protect the people's freedom rather than endanger it. All of these now must be settled, not evaded, and settled by violence, violence having been unleashed. Non-military topics that Catton wove into his narrative included, among many others, the presidential election of 1864, political maneuvering in Washington throughout the conflict, the rise of the Copperhead element within the Democratic Party, the anti-war element, labor violence in the anthracite coal regions of Pennsylvania, anti-conscription activities, and attitudes toward African Americans among the loyal white citizenry. However effective the trilogy's integration of non-military aspects of the war, Catton's exploration of common soldiers formed the core of his narrative. The opening sentence of a preface he wrote for a reissue of Mr. Lincoln's Army in 1962 signaled this focus. The books which make up this trilogy began very simply as an effort to understand the men who fought in the Army of the Potomac, he wrote. He recalled his youthful hero worship of veterans who seemed to have been caught up in what he thought as a boy was a romantic business. But the more mature Catton realized that war obviously is the least romantic of all man's activities, and it contains elements which the veterans do not describe to children. In a sense, the research that went into these books was simply an effort to find out about the things which the soldiers never discussed. And we all know that this is true of veterans from every war, every war. They don't talk about things that they know people who weren't there won't understand. Telling the soldier's story opened the way to work on a larger historical canvas because, as Catton put it, the war in which they fought did settle something for us, or incredibly started something which we ourselves have got to finish. It was not only the biggest experience in their own lives, it was in a way the biggest experience in our life as a nation. The unfinished business, as became clear in the trilogy, was the promise of emancipation. Catton anticipated a later flowering of scholarship on common soldiers. It's a huge sub-literature now in the field, as many of you know. There's so much work on common soldiers. There's almost none at the time that he was writing. Bell Wiley's Life of Johnny Reb was the first, and Wiley published Life of Billy Yank as a companion volume in 1952, the same year Glory Road came out. Catton's trilogy, together with the work of Bell Wiley, marked a striking change in a field long dominated by attention to celebrated generals and their battles. Catton's books eventually reached far more readers than Wiley's, making him, rather than his able contemporary, the critical figure in this interpretive shift. Anyone who reads the trilogy will learn a great deal about recruitment, about life in camp and on the march, about reactions to battle, about medical care, about desertion, about tensions between the true volunteers of 1861-62 and the men who received bounties after passage of the Conscription Act in 1863, about attitudes within the ranks toward Army commanders and other officers, about enmity toward anti-war elements of the loyal population, and about the challenge of bringing African-American soldiers into Union service. Black soldiers play a minor role in Catton's trilogy, as they did in most of the Army of the Potomac's history. No United States colored troops units, USCT units, served in the Army until 1864. The Army waged its most celebrated battles, therefore, with no black men in the ranks. These battles included the 7 Days, Second Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and even the Wilderness and Spotsylvania in terms of black men in combat roles. Their first serious combat for the USCT soldiers came in the assaults at Petersburg on June 15, 1864. And their most famous engagements in the Army of the Potomac's theater included the Crater in late July 1864, New Market Heights in late September, and finally the Appomattox campaign. Catton did not sugarcoat white soldiers' attitudes toward their black comrades. The average northern white man of that era might refuse to associate with the Negro or hold himself to be immeasurably the Negro's superior, wrote Catton. But there was a war on and the country needed soldiers, and if federal corpses were the price of victory, it hardly paid to be finicky about the original color of the corpses' skins. Beyond that baseline of prejudice, Catton added, the real trouble lay in the assumption that while it was all right to let the Negro get shot at, it was foolish to expect him to do any serious fighting first. It's the white attitude. Catton described rebel soldiers' fury when they encountered USCT men at the Crater, as well as the black soldiers' impulse, fueled by knowledge of what had happened at Fort Pillow, Tennessee in April 1864, to execute Confederate prisoners on the spot. The appearance of USCT units in the spring of 1864 figured in a fundamental shift, argued Catton, quote, which indeed was a good deal more complex than most of the participants were able to understand. This shift went beyond casualties, beyond the grinding physical and emotional toll of day-to-day carnage during the Overland campaign. I'll come back to Catton now. The war had taken on a new magnitude, he insisted, and perhaps it was no longer the kind of struggle anybody could win, but it was moving inexorably toward its end, and when it ended, many things would end with it, in the South and in the North as well. Some of these were things that ought to end because they shackled men to the past. and some of them were fit to be laid away in the shadowland of dreams that are remembered forever. But in any case, they were being brought to an end. After that, there could be a new beginning. The trilogy also addressed the increasing severity of the war. The Fredericksburg Campaign of 1862 highlights the war's growing harshness. The first day, the day before the battle on December 13th, Union soldiers sacked the old colonial town in a spasm of wild destruction. The war was changing, wrote Catton. It had reached a point now where the fighting of it turned loose some unpleasant emotional drives. It had become a war against slavery, against the men who owned slaves, by inevitable extension against that man and his family and his goods and chattels, who by living with the hated institution seemed to have made war necessary, and who in any case were standing on the road when the Avengers came. 20 months after the firing on Fort Sumter, the conflict had reached a point where, in Catton's words, the people here in Virginia had become aliens, and their land was strange and foreign, and therefore subject to hate. Books about an army necessarily include many descriptions of battles, and those parts of Catton's narrative convey a vivid and often disturbing immediacy. I'll quote from two. On May 12, 1864, the armies contended for a small arc of Confederate breastworks at Spotsylvania. This was the Bloody Angle. Readers learned about the second engagement of U.S. Grant and Robert E. Lee's Overland Campaign, the place where the trench made a little bend and where the two armies might have clasped hands as they fought. And it was precisely here that the war came down to its darkest cockpit. The fighting was formless, monstrous, something no general could will. It grew out of what these men were and what the war had taught them: cruel knowledge of killing, wild, brief contempt for death, furious, unspeakable ferocity that could transcend every limitation of whipped nerves and beaten flesh. The weather, Catton told readers, conspired to make things worse. As they grappled in the driving rain with the smoke and the wild shouting and the great shock of gunfire all about them, this one muddy ditch with a log wall running down the middle became the center of the whole world. Nothing mattered except to possess it utterly or to clog it breast high with corpses. There was no victory in all of this, and there was no defeat. There was just fighting, and it had become an end in itself. 20 hours of combat, readers learned, brought no more than a slight realignment of the Union and Confederate positions. And within days, the two battered armies continued their bloody progress southward toward Petersburg. My second example concerns action at Chancellorsville on the evening of May 2nd, 1863. Catton memorably reconstructed the rapid collapse of Major General Oliver Otis Howard's unsuspecting 11th Corps soldiers on the Union right flank. The sun was getting low. Far away beyond the woods to the south, there was a muffled sound of musketry. Into a little clearing in front, innumerable deer had suddenly emerged from the woods to the west and were galloping madly toward the east, while the soldiers waved their hats and whooped. Then, as the deer scampered off into the underbrush, the quiet of the spring evening caved in with a stupendous crash. Out of the forest to the west, there came a handful of rifle shots, then the wild, weird falsetto of the rebel yell, followed by great rolling volleys of musketry. Catton then distilled into two sentences the moment of crisis for Howard's westernmost units as the weight of Jackson's attack quickly settled the issue. Von Gilsa's skirmish line of two German regiments looked up to see all the rebels in the world shouldering their way through the tangle, firing their rifles and yelling like fiends, their lines extending far beyond division to right and left. The Germans got off a few hasty shots, and then the flood rolled over them. Abraham Lincoln described the Civil War in July 1861 as essentially a people's contest that would decide the fate of representative government. Later, in his address at Gettysburg in November 1863, he reminded listeners that the people were most responsible for deciding the issue were the brave men, living and dead, who wore blue uniforms. Bruce Catton introduced readers to those soldiers as effectively as any historian. Inevitably a product of his time, his trilogy includes some outdated language, perhaps most obviously passages dealing with African American soldiers, whom he described in then current terms as Negro or colored troops. But linguistic anachronisms do not lessen the value of what Catton accomplished. Those who traverse his trilogy develop a better understanding of how the conflict played out and why the United States triumphed. At the end, they share the soldier's perspective, because Catton chose not to follow U.S. Grant and other Union officers into the McLean family parlor at Appomattox Courthouse. Instead, he gave readers the perspective of common soldiers watching the officers ride by. The little cavalcade went trotting along the road to the village, read the trilogy's penultimate sentence, and all around them the two armies waited in silence. As the generals neared the end of their ride, a Yankee band in a field near the town struck up Auld Lang Syne. I can't imagine that any other writer would choose this way, this perfect way, to finish a book that focuses on the common soldiers. Everybody would follow Grant toward his meeting with Lee in McLean's parlor, not Catton. Catton's reputation as a Civil War historian grew steadily through the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s. He published 3 excellent books about Grant, beginning with U.S. Grant and the American military tradition, a slender volume published in 1954 that anticipated the direction Grant scholarship would take in the late 20th and 21st century. Grant moves south and Grant Takes Command, published in 1960 and 1969, respectively, completed a 3-volume military biography begun by Lloyd Lewis in 1950 with a book titled Captain Sam Grant. Lewis's widow had asked that Catton finish the job. This Hallowed Ground, the story of the Union side of the Civil War, a 1956 title, was part of Doubleday's Mainstream of America series. Catton's impact during the centennial years easily exceeded that of any other historian. In 1960, as I've already said, readers, including myself, devoured his 60,000-word narrative for the American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War. That book had an initial printing of 300,000 copies in the first year of the Civil War centennial, achieving enormous commercial success. One reviewer echoed many others in stating, quote, "It would be difficult to find a better introduction to the Civil War than this sumptuous book." A second trilogy, The Centennial History of the Civil War, followed over the next 5 years, Becoming Fury in 1961, Terrible Swift Sword in 1962, and Never Call Retreat in 1965. Once again, the old journalist met his deadlines. Centennial History of the War was actually published before the centennial ended. I've read all of Catton's books. There's several that I haven't mentioned, including his memoir titled Waiting for the Morning Train and American Boyhood. But I always come back to the Army of the Potomac trilogy. For me, it best reveals Catton's visceral connection to the war. The key to understanding Catton lies with the blue-clad citizen soldiers who left Benzonia, Michigan, and countless other northern communities to don blue uniforms and shoulder muskets. They offered their service and possibly their long-term health or lives to suppress the slaveholders' rebellion. They provide the narrative pulse for Mr. Lincoln's Army, Glory Road, and A Stillness at Appomattox. No one has told their story with its manifold military, political, cultural, and human resonances better than Bruce Catton. I'm going to close with a passage describing Union soldiers near Appomattox Courthouse when they realized that Lee would indeed surrender his army on April 9th, 1865. All up and down the lines, the men blinked at one another, unable to realize that the hour they had waited for so long had actually come. It was Palm Sunday, and they would all live to see Easter. And with the guns quieted, it might be easier to comprehend the mystery and the promise of that day. Yet the fact of peace and no more killing in an open road home seems to have been too big to grasp right at that moment. And in the enormous silence that lay upon the field, men remembered that they had marched far and were very tired, and they wondered when the wagon trains would come up with rations.